Hello, thank you for joining this week's Washington Talk. I'm Ji-ha Ham. The South Korean government officially began its process to normalize the operation of the U.S. THAAD anti-missile system. As South Korea takes steps forward, the THAAD issue is re-emerging as a factor disrupting South Korea and China relations. Meanwhile, the national security advisors from the United States, South Korea, and Japan had a meeting this week to discuss regional issues, including North Korea's nuclear program. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
THAAD is a prudent and limited self-defense capability designed to counter DPRK weapons programs. Criticism or pressure on the ROK to abandon its self-defense is inappropriate.
In the studio with me is Randall Schriver, the chairman of the board of the Project 2049 Institute. Mr. Schriver served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. Previously, Mr. Schriver served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Patrick Cronin is also with me today. Dr. Cronin is Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks. He formerly served as Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. South Korea has announced that it will conduct an environmental impact assessment of the THAAD system. The government said that the move will help normalize the operation of THAAD. But many expect that China will once again express its discomfort against Seoul's new plan. Mr. Schriver, China has claimed that the radar of THAAD penetrate Chinese territory, and the system itself can intercept Chinese ICBMs heading the U.S. Is this true?
We've spent a lot of time talking to our Chinese interlocutors about this system and how it's optimized, which is not for the purpose of defeating China's nuclear arsenal, or contributing really in any way to the strategic stability between the United States and China. They understand this very well. What they're opposed to is any steps to strengthen the U.S.-South Korean alliance, and that's why they take these sub-issues like THAAD and blow them up into bigger things, even though they know they're not the target of this system, and it's a purely defensive system. Even the fact that we talk about the THAAD issue rather than the North Korean missile issue or the China missile issue is evidence that they're controlling the narrative in ways that are difficult for us, but I would say very manageable.
Okay. Dr. Cronin, why does China only raise its voices against South Korea on the deployment of this issue? I mean, a Japanese military official told VOA that Japan is free from China's aggression over this, because even though Japan has deployed a U.S. missile defense system.
Well, that's only true relatively recently. So if you look at over the decades, Japan was having to fend off the China, playing the Japan card year in, year out. Japan essentially responded to China's assertiveness and started to stand up to Japan, and they had a more political unity within Japan under the Liberal Democratic Party than, say, in Korea, where you have a peninsular, back and forth pendulum swing in the politics of Korea. So Korea became more susceptible to the information operations and to the pressure techniques out of Beijing than did Japan. But Japan still faces pressure. China just chooses a different strategy for trying to envelop Japan and isolate it and work on its weaknesses in other ways.
Okay. Mr. Schriver, in 2017 or 2018, China introduced some retaliatory measures over the deployment. But many people say that the US government at that time didn't do much to help South Korea or to stop China. Do you agree? I mean, you were the Assistant Secretary of Defense at that time. So maybe was there a behind-the-scene type of cooperation between the United States and South Korea?
Well, at some level, if people feel like that in South Korea, then we failed to provide all the reassurance that we should have. But I can tell you, yes, behind the scenes, there was a lot of engagement with the Chinese side to explain the nature of the system, why it was optimized for other mission sets. Again, they understand that, but that's not their issue. Their issue is things that strengthen the U.S. ROK alliance, and they sought to find any way to divide us or drive wedges. They happened to fall on one that was controversial in South Korea. So we've watched the last few years how debate in South Korea has been very robust and vigorous over this issue. So when the Chinese see that kind of domestic division and debate, they think there's an opportunity to drive a wedge. So again, if this is the feeling of many in South Korea, we can do better as we go forward. But I would suggest the Chinese are very vigilant at finding these issues that they think are wedge issues, and it's just something we're going to have to deal with in this environment.
Right. Dr. Cronin, the State Department said criticism or pressure on the ROK to abandon its self-defense is inappropriate. Are we seeing something different here? Does this mean the U.S.-ROK relations are now in good shape?
Well, they are in good shape. I think the main difference, though, is the South Korean government. Under President Yoon, you have strong political will to stand up for South Korean interests and not to be cowed by the rhetoric and the disinformation that might be coming out of Beijing, trying to sow that division, both inside South Korea, but also across the alliance. And I think, therefore, it's mostly owing to the South Korean government that we now have the stronger unity that China will have to deal with, just as Russia's trying to use energy and weaponize it globally as a threat. China has a lot of economic levers. They'll undoubtedly try to find some weaknesses and penalties they can exact when they don't get their way, but they know they're dealing with a more unified alliance.
Let's move on to the next topic, Taiwan. So Mr. Schriver, in the worst case scenario, if any conflict occurs in the Taiwan Strait, and let's say the U.S. gets involved militarily, then can we imagine a situation where we don't see South Korea's involvement?
Well, I think it would be such a significant event that everyone in the region would be forced to take a position of some kind. And so I think at some level, South Korea would have discrete choices to make and have some level of involvement. Being ready to fight tonight means we always keep our focus on North Korea and the situation on the Korean Peninsula. So I don't know that there'd be a huge or significant military role for ROK forces, but certainly politically, economically, diplomatically, the response, we would hope our South Korean allies would be alongside us. And our plans for the defense of Taiwan, which our law requires us to have, we maintain the capacity to resist force consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, are constantly being revised and adjusted. And so there may be a need in a ballistic missile, cruise missile environment for us to have dispersal opportunities and diversification opportunities. And those are the kinds of things where I could imagine the U.S. and the ROK would want to have deep discussions about now rather than ad hoc at the time of a crisis.
Japan has already hinted that it will support Taiwan if anything happens in Taiwan. Japan's position seems to be tougher on China always compared to South Korea. Why is this?
Well, partly it's geographical. The Senkaku Islands are also a flashpoint. They're very close. They're almost equidistant from the cross-strait issue, almost 100 miles from the mainland and almost 100 miles really from the Senkakus to Taiwan. So if you think about the lines of communication, Japan would be right there in it. Also, the U.S. forces concentrated in Okinawa, which might come to bear in a conflict over Taiwan, would inextricably be caught up, U.S., Japan. So they really can't move out of the way. Geographically, they're just too close to it. I think there's another reason, though, and that's that Japan has learned over time that the best way to deter aggression is to make sure you're unmistakably clear about your aims and the need to preserve peace and to be insistent that there be peaceful resolution of disputes. Just as the Mutual Defense Treaty, by the way, with US and Korea says, there has to be peaceful resolution of disputes and not let China change the rules because they've decided to forcefully unify Taiwan.
Mr. Schriver, there are voices that South Korea should be tougher on China, but as we know, China is South Korea's major trading partner, and in reality, China is in the position that can retaliate South Korea. So what do you think of that?
China's a major trading partner of the United States, of Japan, Australia, basically every country in the Indo-Pacific. So these are questions that each sovereign government has to cope with and struggle with. I think the question that doesn't get asked often enough is, what's the consequence for not taking a tougher stand? And will you spare yourself some of the cost imposition that China has, that China is positioned to do? And I think back to our previous conversation about THAAD deployment, South Korea did pay some price through economic sanctions, the sanctioning of the South Korean businesses in China. So these are things that we need to think through, but I think we have ample evidence that not taking a tougher stand involves costs and risk as well. So we'll continue to talk about this in the context of our alliance, but I feel as though things are aligning better and sovereign decisions certainly for Seoul to make, but I think we're moving in a better direction when it comes to having a stronger deterrence.
Dr. Cronin, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think since the inauguration of President Yoon, he has stood up for South Korean interests and made it clear that he's not just going to buckle under to China's demands. Having said that, you've seen Park Jin, foreign minister, go to Qingdao, have quiet discussions with the Chinese, probably be berated by the Chinese over what they think should be the rules of the road. I didn't see him concede. I didn't see him back off the, the three no's, for instance. I didn't see the Yoon administration embrace the three no's, no more THAADs, not integrated in an alliance, not integrated with a network of ballistic missile defenses that President Moon had made. And I think that's an important already delineation. That's standing up for South Korean interests and autonomy, which is a tough thing to do. And this is what we've seen out of the Yoon administration so far. That's a good sign.
Meanwhile, the national security advisors from the United States, South Korea, and Japan had a meeting this week. The three countries have agreed there will be no soft response if North Korea conducts a nuclear test. Dr. Cronin, it's a new trend that three countries regularly meet on all levels. But how does the ongoing dispute between South Korea and Japan affect the U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific area in the trilateral relations?
Well, it prevents all three countries from better meeting their national security interests. I think there's a sea change going on here right now. There's a huge opportunity. And we're seeing, because of the political will coming out of Seoul, there's an opportunity to forge closer collaboration with Japan and the United States for the common interest. I go back more than 100 years and think about when Syngman Rhee was sitting in a jail in 1904 in Seoul. And he penned a book, I can't imagine him doing this, in jail, about the spirit of independence. That's exactly what the South Koreans need right now. But the spirit of independence, what Japan and the US refer to often as the free and open Indo-Pacific, essentially, is a common interest. And the danger to that is coming from North Korea, it's coming from China's overreach. And so recognizing that those are the dangers to the future of Korean independence and Japanese independence and American independence should be forcing us closer together, not just so that national security advisors meet periodically. That's important. But that we really start to take some steps together. And I don't want to exaggerate how far this is going to go, but we have an opportunity that is historic, I think, right now.
Mr. Schriver, the Yoon government said GSOMIA, the information sharing agreement between Japan and South Korea, will be normalized as soon as possible. As we know, it has been conditionally extended. So what is the importance of GSOMIA to the U.S.? Is GSOMIA directly related to the U.S. security?
It is. First of all, in just the strictly military terms, it makes us better in terms of information sharing in an environment where rapid communications, rapid data sharing is absolutely critical when you're talking about ballistic and cruise missiles and one's defense or collectively the defense of the free and open Indo-Pacific. So there's no question that it makes us better positioned on military terms. But it's also, of course, politically significant and diplomatically significant when you think about what does China fear? What might possibly deter them? It's the notion that countries are aligning in ways that are counter to their ambitions, not anti-China per se, but counter to their ambitions to alter the free and open status of the Indo-Pacific. So when they see Japan and South Korea and the United States getting together, likely it gives them pause to do things more aggressively in pursuit of their ambitions.
South Korea has tried to reinforce the extended deterrence recently. And President Biden said the U.S. will work with South Korea to further strengthen the deterrence posture. The deterrence was always there, though. I mean, but why is it has become an important issue lately?
Well, I think it has been an issue for a long time in our relationship because it's an assumption that both sides have to make, somewhat based on confidence in one another, that we would actually go to those lengths should South Korea be threatened with nuclear weapons or, God forbid, attacked. So I think this is really an issue about credibility. And there are things that the United States, I think, can do to strengthen that credibility. I know we're going to have bilateral discussions on this subject, but there are things that our adversaries and potential adversaries also need to see so that they understand we're serious about this. So demonstrations of our capabilities, for example, B-2s in the region and having operations in South Korea, would be a way to say, not only do we say this as part of declaratory policy, but we mean it, we're serious, and we have capabilities that we're willing to demonstrate in peacetime to underscore that.
Right. The U.S. said it stands firm in its extended deterrence commitment to the ROK with the full range of U.S. capabilities. And what kind of capabilities are we talking about? Maybe Mr. Schriver maybe laid out some.
Well, he did talk about some of the strategic assets that are available, but before you think about what other assets we have, the thing is that deterrence isn't completely stable when North Korea is building up. And if North Korea proceeds to quadruple its nuclear weapons the way China's doing essentially right now over the next several years, this could be open up a new threat. Because think about the Russian threat to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine and Europe. Tactical nuclear weapons, the idea that you could possibly use a nuclear weapon for offensive purposes, not just for deterrence, is the threat here. So the United States and South Korea, along with Japan and others, need to think about keeping ahead of the curve of this changing challenge to deterrence. Because frankly, after Kim Yo-jong's disparaging remarks about the Yoon plan for dialogue, we're not stopping North Korea. All we can do is deter them at the moment and build up our own strength and defense and make sure that he doesn't miscalculate. So I can't tell you about specifically what systems will do that at this point. It's much more important that we are on the same strategic wavelength, keeping ahead of this dialogue. And that's why these trilateral national security events are very important.
But Mr. Schriver, but we still hear skeptical voices, over this. I mean, over the extended deterrence. I mean, simply there's no case study that shows the U.S. used a nuclear capability to defend its allies. So instead of hearing, the U.S. saying promises, committing or commitment, would there be any other way that the U.S. assure, its allies?
Well, we're thankful that there's no case study. That would be a horrific event, even if it politically came out successfully for us. Look, there's a certain amount of faith we're going to have because these are events, as you say, that haven't transpired in the past, and we haven't been put in that very difficult position. But I think we have a large number of American forces in South Korea. It's inconceivable that South Korea would be attacked with strategic weapons where the U.S. wouldn't be directly impacted, our forces. We have a number of other American citizens who live in South Korea. It's an important alliance to us in terms of the overall strategic picture in the Indo-Pacific. So I think our interests are quite clear and they rise to the level of strategic importance. But again, giving that reassurance, I think what we can do is have these public comments, but backed up by very visible demonstrations of our capabilities. We have strategic assets that aren't visible, things underwater, for example, a very important part of our deterrence, but doing things that are visible. So North Korea understands the serious nature of our commitment. China understands. Russia These are things that I think we need to do a little more of.
Dr. Cronin, because of the skepticism in South Korea, some say that it is now time to consider South Korea to have its own nuclear weapon. Is this understandable argument?
Well, it's understandable because we watch North Korea continue to build up its arsenal of both ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, talking about hypersonic missiles, talking about tactical nuclear weapons, and maybe to see a 7th or 8th nuclear test at the end of the year. All of these are not being stopped by anything but deterrence. So it's very important for that extended deterrence to work. So even if South Koreans wanted to today dedicate to building or considering to build a nuclear weapon, it'd be years away before they had an effective arsenal. So right now, South Korea's best bet is to make sure they're leveraging the alliance extended deterrence, working on their own conventional capabilities, working with Japan and the United States to make sure that together we put out a network security for deterrence and defense. That's the most effective answer right now, and that'll be true for the next 5-10 years.
Yeah. Mr. Schreiber, what do you think of South Korea's idea that having their own nuclear weapons?
Well, as Dr. Cronin said, I understand the debate and why some people might be attracted to this option. I think you have to think second, third order effects of that kind of move and how that could create interest in sovereign independent nuclear capabilities on the part of other countries. It's very difficult to think of a situation where South Korea takes this step where Japan wouldn't be more tempted, and obviously that has entered the public debate in Japan for their own reasons. So there might be a difficult follow-on effect related to proliferation that would put us all in a little bit more difficult situation, not a better situation. The other thing is, for somebody who, Dr. Cronin and myself, who care about the alliance, pursuing an independent capability is, in a way, a vote of no confidence. It's saying we don't trust that extended deterrence, and that would be concerning. So for those reasons as well, I think, as Dr. Cronin said, strengthening the extended deterrence arrangement is the best approach as far as my eyes can see.
And on top of that, what Mr. Schreiber is pointing out, what the Yoon administration's recommitted to is the nuclear non-proliferation. And that's what the alliance stands for. And that's what our alliance with Japan stands for as well. So we're on the side of the good here for the international community. And those who are proliferating, they're upsetting that rules-based order.
Some say the U.S. Can use these claims as an idea to make China to press North Korea. What do you think?
We have a long history trying to get China to pressure North Korea to denuclearize. It's not a very good history, successful history, because I think the Chinese have different interests or at least different priorities. I think the most effective approach right now is to work with allies. Obviously, China plays an important role, and if there are ways to persuade them to be more constructive, I'm all open to hearing about it, but our history over the last couple decades suggests it's going to be pretty difficult to get China on the right side.
But wouldn't it be a different story if South Korea, start developing nuclear weapons, though?
There are different ways to try to incentivize China. I think that one would carry a lot of other risks that we just talked about in terms of proliferation and in terms of instability. I don't think that's the route, particularly since, again, we don't have a good history of getting the Chinese on the right side of this.
Right. Dr. Cronin, anything to add?
Well, yeah, I think right now, while China's very good at defending its interests, it's defining its interests right now in not cooperating with the United States to deal with North Korea. At this moment in history, they'd be more likely to support South Korea's nuclear weapon development if they thought it would rupture Japan, Korea, and the United States alliance, frankly.
The U.S. and South Korea this week completed their joint military exercise, Ulchi Freedom Shield. Some experts suggest it is now time to watch closely whether North Korea engages in provocative acts in response to the joint exercise. Mr. Schreiber, Dr. Cronin, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.